What kind of person calls the cops on their neighbor for planting flowers on their own land? That was the question burning in my mind as I stood on my front porch, watching Karen Whitaker march across the street, her phone pressed to her ear, voice sharp enough to slice through the morning calm. She was the self-appointed queen of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, a woman who wielded her clipboard like a scepter and her rulebook like a guillotine. I'd only lived here for 3 months, but I'd already learned her name was synonymous with control. Today, though, she'd picked the wrong fight. I'd spent the morning digging in the strip of land at the edge of my property, a narrow patch I'd bought outright from the county before moving in. It was mine, deed and all, but Karen didn't care about deeds. She cared about uniformity, about her vision of a perfect neighborhood where every blade of grass knelt to her standards. I was planting marigolds, bright bursts of orange and yellow, when she stormed over, her heels clicking like gunfire on the pavement. "You can't plant those," she snapped, her eyes narrowing as if I'd committed a felony. "HOA rules state all landscaping must be approved." I tried to explain calmly at first that this wasn't HOA land. It was mine. She didn't listen. She never did. Instead, she dialed 911, claiming I was vandalizing the neighborhood. As I stood there, dirt smudged on my hands, I felt the weight of her gaze, not just on me but on everything I represented. An outsider, a threat to her carefully curated world. The marigolds were a rebellion, a splash of color against her monochrome empire. I could have argued, could have shouted, but I didn't. I just watched her, knowing the truth was on my side. The police would come, and they'd see the deed. But this wasn't just about flowers or land. This was about Karen and the power she thought she had. The squad car pulled up 10 minutes later, its lights flashing lazily in the summer heat. 2 officers stepped out, one young and bored, the other older, with the weary look of someone who'd mediated too many petty disputes. Karen launched into her tirade before they could even ask my name, pointing at the marigolds like they were evidence in a murder trial. "He's defacing community property," she declared, her voice carrying to the neighbors now peeking from their windows. I stayed quiet, letting her dig her own grave. The older officer, whose badge read Daniels, asked for my side. I handed him the deed, a single sheet of paper that felt heavier than it looked. He read it, raised an eyebrow, and handed it back. "This is your land, Mr. Ellis," he said, loud enough for Karen to hear. Her face froze, a mask of disbelief cracking at the edges. But Karen wasn't done. She doubled down, insisting the HOA had jurisdiction, that I was violating community standards. The younger officer sighed, clearly wanting to be anywhere else, but Daniels listened patiently before turning to her. "Ma'am, if he owns the land, he can plant whatever he wants." The words hit her like a slap, but she didn't back off. She clutched her phone tighter, muttering about calling her lawyer, about escalating this. I could have walked away then, gone back to my marigolds, but something in her eyes, a flicker of desperation, made me pause. This wasn't just about control. There was something deeper, something personal driving her. I didn't know what it was yet, but I would. The neighbors were out now, drawn by the drama like moths to a porch light. Mrs. Larson, the retired schoolteacher, stood on her lawn, shaking her head. Mr. Patel, who ran the corner store, leaned against his mailbox, smirking. They'd all felt Karen's wrath at some point, her fines for untrimmed hedges, her lectures about mailbox colors. But none of them had challenged her like this. Not until me. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I just wanted to plant my damn flowers. But as I watched Karen storm back to her house, her shoulders rigid with fury, I realized this was only the beginning. She wasn't going to let this go, and neither was I. That night I sat on my porch, the marigolds glowing faintly under the streetlights. The deed lay on the table beside me, a quiet reminder of the truth. But truth doesn't always win. Not when someone like Karen is involved. She'd built her kingdom on rules and fear, and I just poked a hole in its foundation. I didn't know it then, but that hole was about to widen, exposing secrets she'd fought to keep buried. The next morning I found a letter in my mailbox, an HOA violation notice, signed by Karen herself. It demanded I remove the marigolds by week's end or face a $500 fine. I laughed, crumpling the paper. She still didn't get it. But she would. Soon enough, she'd learned that power built on lies doesn't last. The letter was just the start. Karen's next move came faster than I expected. A calculated escalation that showed how far she'd go to protect her authority. By noon the next day, a tow truck rumbled into the cul-de-sac, its driver eyeing my old pickup parked on the street. Karen stood beside it, arms crossed, directing the driver like a general commanding a siege. Apparently my truck was too close to the curb. Another HOA violation she'd conjured up overnight. I stepped outside, the crumpled violation notice still in my pocket, and caught her eye. She didn't flinch. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Mr. Ellis," she said, her voice dripping with false civility. The driver hesitated, sensing the tension, but I waved him off. The truck wasn't going anywhere, not today. I could have shown her the deed again, could have called the cops back, but I wanted to understand her. Why was she so obsessed with controlling this neighborhood? It wasn't just about me or the Marigolds. I started asking around, quietly, piecing together the puzzle of Karen Whitaker. Mrs. Larson was the first to open up, over tea in her cluttered living room. "She wasn't always like this," she said, her voice soft with pity. 10 years ago, she was just a widow trying to keep things together after her husband passed. The HOA gave her purpose, a way to fill the void. I nodded, sipping the tea, but I wasn't convinced. Grief doesn't turn someone into a tyrant overnight. There had to be more. That's when Mr. Patel dropped the twist that changed everything. We were chatting by his store, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the counter, when he leaned in, voice low. "You know why she's so fixated on that strip of land you bought?" he asked. I shook my head, bracing for it. Her husband owned it before he died. She thought it was still hers, part of the HOA's domain. She's been collecting dues on it for years, claiming it as community property. My jaw tightened. Karen hadn't just made a mistake. She'd been profiting off land she didn't own, land I'd legally purchased. The violation notices, the tow truck, the cops, it wasn't about rules. It was about covering her tracks. I spent the next few days digging deeper, pulling records from the county office. Sure enough, Karen had been listing that strip as HOA property in their annual filings, pocketing maintenance fees from the neighbors for a decade. It wasn't a fortune, maybe a few $100 a year, but it was enough to expose her. I could have gone straight to the HOA board, could have blown the whistle, but I wanted her to feel the weight of her own choices first. I printed the county records and slipped them into an envelope, leaving it in her mailbox with a note. "We need to talk." Her response came at the next HOA meeting, a monthly gathering in the community center that felt more like a courtroom than a neighborhood chat. I walked in late, the envelope tucked under my arm, and felt every eye turn to me. Karen sat at the head of the table, her face a mask of composure, but her hands betrayed her, fidgeting with a pen. She opened the meeting with her usual spiel about maintaining property values, but her voice faltered when she saw me. I didn't say a word, not yet. I just sat there letting her stew, letting the room feel the tension. The other neighbors shifted uncomfortably, sensing something was coming. They weren't wrong. When it was my turn to speak, I stood, unfolding the envelope. "This is about the land I own," I said, holding up the county records. "And the money Karen's been collecting on it for years." The room went silent, a collective intake of breath. Karen's face drained of color, but she recovered quickly, slamming her hand on the table. "This is slander," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You're trying to undermine the HOA." I didn't flinch. I passed the records around, letting the truth speak for itself. Whispers spread like wildfire, shock, anger, betrayal. Karen had ruled them through fear, but fear only works until the truth comes out. By the end of the meeting, the room was divided. Some neighbors, loyal to Karen's iron grip, defended her, claiming it was a misunderstanding. Others, like Mrs. Larson and Mr. Patel, looked at her with new eyes, seeing the cracks in her facade. I didn't need them all to believe me, not yet. I just needed them to question her. As I left the community center, the envelope now in Mrs. Larson's hands, I caught Karen's gaze. For the first time, she looked small, like a queen realizing her throne was made of sand. But I knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. The fallout from the meeting was immediate. By morning, my mailbox was stuffed with anonymous notes, some calling me a troublemaker, others thanking me for standing up to Karen. The neighborhood was a powder keg and I'd lit the fuse. Karen didn't waste time. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, claiming urgent matters required immediate action. I wasn't invited, but Mr. Patel tipped me off. "She's rallying her allies," he said, his voice grim. "Be careful, Ellis. She's not just fighting for control now, she's fighting for survival." I nodded, feeling the weight of what I'd started. This wasn't just about marigolds anymore. It was about justice, about exposing a lie that had festered for years. I showed up uninvited, deed in hand, ready for a showdown. The community center was packed, the air thick with tension. Karen stood at the front, flanked by her loyalists, Mr. Jenkins, a retired banker who nodded at her every word, and Mrs. Carver, whose perfectly manicured lawn was Karen's pride and joy. They were her shield, but I could see the cracks in their loyalty, the way their eyes darted when I walked in. Karen didn't acknowledge me at first, launching into a speech about community unity and resisting divisive newcomers. It was a performance, polished and desperate, but I wasn't here to clap. When she opened the floor, I stood, my voice steady. "Let's talk about the land," I said, holding up the deed. "And the dues you've been charging for it." The room erupted, shouts, gasps, accusations. Karen tried to shut it down, banging her gavel, but the truth was out, and it was louder than her. I laid out the evidence. County records, HOA filings, even a bank statement I'd gotten from a whistleblower on the board, showing the maintenance fees funneled into Karen's personal account. The numbers weren't huge, but the betrayal was. Neighbors who trusted her, who'd paid her dues without question, now saw her for what she was. Then came the twist I hadn't seen coming. Mrs. Larson stood, her frail frame trembling with anger, and dropped a bombshell. "It's not just the land," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Karen's been skimming from the community fund for years. Pool repairs, streetlights, all of it." She held up a ledger, pages marked with discrepancies she'd noticed as the former treasurer. The room went deathly quiet. Even Karen's allies looked shaken. Mrs. Larson, the quiet schoolteacher, had been keeping her own records, waiting for the right moment. That moment was now. Karen's composure shattered. "This is a witch hunt," she screamed, her face red, veins bulging. She pointed at me, at Mrs. Larson, at anyone who dared meet her eyes. "You're all jealous, trying to tear me down." But the room wasn't hers anymore. Mr. Patel stood next, recounting how Karen had fined him for a non-compliant mailbox, only to pocket the money. Others followed, their stories pouring out like a dam breaking, fines, threats, petty power plays. Karen tried to interrupt, but her voice was drowned out by the chorus of betrayal. I didn't need to say another word. The neighbors were doing the work for me, their anger a tide washing away her authority. But Karen wasn't done. She lunged for the ledger in Mrs. Larson's hands, a desperate grab for control, and that's when Mr. Jenkins stepped in. "Enough, Karen," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. He'd been her biggest supporter, but even he couldn't ignore the evidence. She froze, her hands trembling, and for a moment, I saw not a tyrant but a woman unraveling, her world collapsing under the weight of her own lies. As the meeting ended, the board voted to suspend Karen pending an audit. She stormed out, tears in her eyes, leaving behind a room buzzing with shock and relief. I walked home under the streetlights, the marigold still standing proud on my land. But victory didn't feel as sweet as I'd expected. Karen's desperation, her refusal to back down, lingered in my mind. She'd lost her throne, but I knew she'd come back swinging. And when she did, I'd be ready. Karen's fall was swift, but it wasn't quiet. The audit began the next week, a forensic accountant tearing through the HOA's books like a bloodhound. Every day brought new revelations, missing funds, inflated invoices, checks cashed in Karen's name. The neighbors were livid, their trust shattered. Mrs. Larson became the unofficial leader, organizing meetings to keep everyone informed. I stayed in the background, letting the community take charge. This wasn't my fight anymore, it was theirs. But Karen wasn't going down without a final stand. She showed up at my house one evening unannounced, her face pale but her eyes burning with defiance. "You think you've won?" she hissed, standing on my porch like a ghost of her former self. "You think you can just walk into my neighborhood and ruin everything?" Her voice cracked, not with anger but with something rawer, grief maybe or shame. I didn't invite her in. I just stood there letting her words spill out. She rambled about her husband, how he'd built the HOA from nothing, how she'd carried on his legacy. "This was all I had left," she said, her voice barely a whisper. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. Then I remembered the ledger, the lies, the neighbors she'd bullied. Sympathy didn't erase the truth. I told her to leave, but not before handing her a copy of the audit's preliminary findings. "This isn't about me," I said. "It's about what you did." She stared at the papers, her hands shaking, then turned and walked away. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, flyers appeared on every doorstep in Willow Creek, accusing me of forging documents, of conspiring to destroy the community. They were signed "Concerned Resident," but the venom was unmistakably Karen's. She was fighting dirty, trying to turn the neighbors against me one last time. The flyers backfired. Instead of rallying to her, the neighbors rallied to me. Mr. Patel organized a petition to dissolve the HOA entirely, arguing it had become a tool for corruption. Mrs. Larson went door to door, sharing the audit findings, her ledger now a weapon against Karen's lies. Even Mr. Jenkins, who'd once stood by her, signed the petition, his face heavy with regret. The community was done with Karen's reign, but the final blow came at the next board meeting, where the accountant presented his report. The numbers were staggering. Over 10 years, Karen had siphoned off nearly $20,000. Small amounts carefully hidden, but enough to fund her vacations, her new car, her perfect life. The room was silent as the accountant read the totals, each digit a nail in the coffin of her authority. Karen wasn't there, she'd been barred from attending, but her absence only amplified the verdict. The board voted unanimously to dissolve the HOA and pursue legal action. Cheers erupted, a release of years of pent-up frustration. I sat in the back watching neighbors hug, their faces alight with hope. But I couldn't shake the image of Karen on my porch, her eyes hollow with loss. That night, I walked to the strip of land where it all began. The marigolds were thriving, their colors defiant in the moonlight. I'd won, but it didn't feel like a victory. Karen's life was unraveling, her reputation, her purpose gone. Part of me wondered if I'd pushed too hard, if there'd been another way. Then I remembered the neighbors, the ones she'd fined, bullied, controlled. This wasn't about me. It was about them, about a community taking back its freedom. I knelt by the marigolds, touching the soil, and made a promise. I'd plant more flowers, not just for me, but for all of us. As I stood, I saw a figure in the distance, Karen watching from her porch. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. I didn't wave or call out. I just turned and walked home, leaving her to the ruins of her kingdom. The HOA was gone, but the real work was just beginning. The weeks after the HOA's collapse were a strange mix of chaos and hope. Without Karen's iron grip, Willow Creek felt like a neighborhood waking from a long sleep. Neighbors started talking again. Not just about fines or rules, but about their lives, their dreams. Mrs. Larson hosted a potluck, the first real community gathering in years, and people showed up with casseroles, laughter, and stories of Karen's overreach. Mr. Patel brought his famous samosas, grinning as he recounted the time Karen fined him for excessive holiday lights. Even Mr. Jenkins, still nursing his guilt, showed up with a pie and an apology. The air was warm, the marigolds a bright backdrop to the evening, and for the first time I felt like I belonged. But Karen's shadow lingered. She'd gone quiet, her house dark most nights, but rumors swirled. Some said she was planning to sue the neighborhood, others that she'd moved out. I didn't care about the rumors, I cared about the truth. So when I saw her car in the driveway one morning, I decided to confront her. Not with anger but with questions. I knocked on her door, half expecting her to slam it in my face. Instead, she opened it, looking tired, older, her eyes red-rimmed. "What do you want, Ellis?" she asked, her voice flat. I didn't have a script, just a need to understand. "Why?" I asked. "Why did you do it?" She didn't answer at first, just stared past me at the street she'd once ruled. Then she invited me in, a gesture that surprised us both. Her living room was a shrine to her late husband. Photos, awards, a faded HOA charter framed on the wall. She sat across from me, her hands clasped tightly. "After Tom died," she said, "the HOA was all I had. It was his dream, his legacy. I thought I was protecting it." Her voice broke and I saw the woman beneath the tyrant, a woman who'd lost everything and clung to control as a lifeline. But then she admitted the rest. The money wasn't for vacations or cars, it was for medical bills, debts Tom had left behind. She'd started small, skimming a little here, a little there, convincing herself it was harmless. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I just didn't know how to stop. I wanted to feel anger, but all I felt was pity." She'd built a cage of her own making, and now it had collapsed around her. I left her house without saying much, just a quiet promise to let the neighbors decide her fate. The community meeting that followed was unlike any before. Mrs. Larson presented the audit's final report, and the room debated what to do. Some wanted to press charges, to make Karen pay for every cent she'd taken. Others, like Mr. Jenkins, argued for leniency, citing her years of service to the neighborhood. I stayed silent, watching the community grapple with its own values. In the end, they voted to settle out of court. Karen would repay what she could, and the neighborhood would move on. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was fair. As spring turned to summer, Willow Creek transformed. The marigolds spread, neighbors planting their own gardens, free from HOA rules. Mr. Patel put up his holiday lights early, and no one complained. Mrs. Larson started a community newsletter, filled with recipes and stories, not fines. I found myself at the center of it all, not as a hero but as a neighbor, someone who'd helped spark a change. But I couldn't forget Karen, alone in her house, her legacy in ruins. I wondered if she'd ever find peace. One evening, as I watered my marigolds, I saw her step onto her porch, holding a small potted plant. She didn't look at me, just knelt and placed it in her yard. A single marigold, bright against the dusk. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a start. Maybe redemption wasn't impossible, even for her. The marigold in Karen's yard became a quiet symbol, a flicker of hope in a neighborhood reborn. Willow Creek was thriving now, its streets alive with color and chatter. Neighbors painted their fences, planted wildflowers, even started a community garden where the old HOA sign once stood. The sign itself was gone, replaced by a wooden plaque that read Willow Creek, our home, our rules. It was Mr. Patel's idea, and we all chipped in to carve it. Every time I passed it, I felt a swell of pride, not for myself but for us, for what we'd built together. But healing a community isn't as simple as planting flowers. Karen's presence was a wound that hadn't fully closed. Some neighbors forgave her, moved by her confession and the marigold she'd planted. Others couldn't, their trust too broken to mend. I saw both sides. I'd seen her vulnerability, the woman who'd lost her way, but I'd also seen the damage she'd done. When I ran into her at the mailbox one morning, she didn't meet my eyes. "I'm trying," she said softly, clutching a letter. "I'm paying it back." I nodded, unsure what to say. Forgiveness wasn't mine to give. It belonged to the neighborhood. The community garden became our new battleground, not for fights but for growth. Mrs. Larson organized planting days and kids ran through the rows, laughing as they dug in the dirt. Mr. Jenkins, still carrying his guilt, showed up every weekend, hauling compost and telling stories about the neighborhood's early days. He'd been there when Tom Whitaker founded the HOA, back when it was about unity, not control. Karen changed after he died, he told me one day, wiping sweat from his brow. She thought she was honoring him, but she lost herself. I listened, planting a row of sunflowers, and wondered if Karen could ever find her way back. Then came the day of the settlement. Karen stood before the neighbors in the community center, her hands trembling as she handed over a check. $15,000, nearly all she had left. It wasn't everything she'd taken, but it was enough to show she meant it. The room was quiet, no cheers or jeers, just a heavy silence. Mrs. Larson took the check, her face unreadable, and thanked her. Karen left without a word, her shoulders slumped. I thought about following her, but what could I say? She'd made her choices, and now she was living with them. The money went to the community garden, a fitting end to the HOA's legacy. We built raised beds, a small gazebo, even a bench where people could sit and talk. The kids painted it bright yellow like the marigolds that started it all. Every time I sat there, I thought about how far we'd come. From Karen's rules to this, a place where everyone had a voice. But I also thought about her, alone in her house trying to rebuild. I hoped she'd find her own garden someday, a place to start over. One afternoon, as I weeded the community plot, a kid ran up, holding a crumpled note. It was from Karen, written in shaky handwriting. "Thank you for the marigolds. They reminded me who I used to be." I folded the note, tucking it into my pocket, and looked at the garden around me. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough to heal us all. As the sun set, casting gold across the flowers, I felt a quiet certainty. Willow Creek wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a community. And no one, not even Karen, could take that away. The seasons changed and Willow Creek grew stronger. The community garden became the heart of the neighborhood. A place where people didn't just plant flowers but planted roots. Families gathered for barbecues, kids played tag among the sunflowers, and even the quietest neighbors started showing up, drawn by the laughter and the sense of belonging. Mrs. Larson's newsletter became a weekly tradition, filled with recipes, stories, and updates on the garden's progress. Mr. Patel's holiday lights stayed up year-round, a twinkling reminder of our freedom. And my marigolds? They spread, popping up in yards across the street, a quiet rebellion that had become a symbol of hope. Karen was still there, a ghost in her own home. She didn't come to the garden, didn't join the potlucks, but I'd see her sometimes, watering her lone marigold or walking to her mailbox, head down. The neighbors didn't shun her, but they didn't embrace her either. Forgiveness was a slow process and some wounds ran too deep. I thought about her note often, the one about remembering who she used to be. I wondered if she'd ever find that person again, or if she'd spend the rest of her days haunted by her mistakes. One spring morning as I tended the community garden, I saw her approach, hesitant, carrying a tray of seedlings. The other neighbors froze, unsure what to do. She didn't look at them, just knelt by an empty plot and started planting. No one spoke, but no one stopped her either. The seedlings were marigolds, their tiny leaves trembling in the breeze. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was a gesture. A step toward redemption. Mrs. Larson, ever the peacemaker, walked over and offered her a trowel. Karen took it, her hands shaking, and for the first time in months I saw her smile. It was small, fragile, but real. That moment didn't erase the past, but it planted something new. Over the weeks, Karen came back. Not every day, but often enough to be noticed. She didn't speak much, just worked quietly, her marigolds blending with ours. Some neighbors warmed to her. Others kept their distance. But the garden grew and so did we. We weren't perfect, there were still arguments, still grudges, but we were learning to listen, to compromise, to build something together. One evening, as the garden glowed under a pink sunset, I sat on the yellow bench, watching the neighborhood come alive. Kids chased fireflies, Mr. Patel argued good-naturedly with Mr. Jenkins about compost, and Mrs. Larson handed out her newsletter, her face bright with pride. Karen was there too, weeding a corner plot, her marigolds thriving. I caught her eye, and she nodded, a silent acknowledgement of everything we'd been through. I nodded back, not as an enemy or a victor, but as a neighbor. Willow Creek had changed and so had I. I'd come here wanting a quiet life, a place to plant my flowers and be left alone. Instead, I'd found a community, a purpose, a fight worth fighting. The marigolds had started it all. A spark of color that ignited a revolution. They'd shown us what was possible when we stood together. When we chose truth over fear, hope over control. Karen's reign was over, but her story wasn't. None of ours were. We were still growing, still learning, still planting. And as long as we had the garden, we'd keep going, one flower at a time.